The message came at exactly 8:42 p.m. Ethan Walker didn't need to check the name. He already knew who it was. Happy anniversary, my love. He stared at the glowing screen for a long moment, his thumb hovering just above the reply button. Around him, the low hum of conversation and blinking glasses filled the dimly lit restaurant. Then he lifted his gaze. 2 tables away, his wife was laughing. Not the polite laugh she used at charity events. Not the soft, rehearsed one she gave their friends. This one was real, and it wasn't for him. Ethan Walker had always believed that betrayal, if it ever came, would arrive loudly. A slammed door, a raised voice, a confession soaked in tears. He had never imagined it would look like this. Quiet, elegant, perfectly composed under warm amber lighting and the soft echo of jazz drifting through the restaurant. He sat alone at a table for 2, a half-finished glass of bourbon in front of him. The condensation had formed a thin ring on the polished wood surface, a detail he found himself staring at longer than necessary, as if grounding himself in something real. Because nothing else felt real anymore. Across the room, Claire tilted her head slightly as she listened to the man across from her. The movement was subtle, almost unconscious, but Ethan recognized it instantly. She used to do that with him. Years ago, back when listening still meant something. The man sitting with her, Daniel Reeves, leaned forward just enough to close the distance between them without making it obvious. A practiced move, confident, intentional. Ethan knew him. Of course he did. Daniel wasn't just anyone. He was a client, a powerful investor with a reputation for turning struggling companies into empires and leaving complicated personal lives in his wake. Ethan had defended him once, in a quiet legal matter that never made the press. He remembered thinking back then that Daniel Reeves was the kind of man who took what he wanted, and now, apparently, that included Ethan's wife. Ethan exhaled slowly, his grip tightening around his phone. The message still glowed on the screen. Happy anniversary, my love. The words felt almost artistic in their cruelty. He glanced back at Claire. She reached for her wine glass, her fingers brushing lightly against Daniel's hand in the process. Neither of them pulled away. It wasn't an accident. Ethan felt something shift inside him, not a sharp pain, not yet. Just a slow, heavy sinking, like a building collapsing in silence. 10 years. 10 years of shared mornings, late-night conversations, vacations carefully documented on social media, smiles captured and filtered and posted for the world to admire. 10 years reduced to this. 2 tables apart, and a lie delivered through a screen. A waiter approached his table, breaking the moment.
Are you waiting for someone, sir?
Ethan looked up, forcing a small, controlled smile. No, he said. I think I'm exactly where I need to be. The waiter nodded politely, unaware of the weight behind those words, and stepped away. Ethan picked up his glass and took a slow sip, the burn of the bourbon grounding him again. He could walk over there. He could end it right now. Expose them, demand an explanation. Watch Claire's face as the illusion shattered in real time. The thought lingered for a moment, then passed. Because something inside him, something colder, quieter, told him that this wasn't the moment. Not yet. Instead, he watched. He watched the way Claire leaned in when Daniel spoke, the way her eyes softened, the way she touched her hair, a small, habitual gesture she only did when she cared about how she was being seen. He noticed everything, all the details he had missed, or perhaps ignored.
Because it was easier to believe in the version of their marriage that looked perfect from the outside.
Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. He placed a few bills on the table, more than enough to cover the drink. Then he stood. For a brief second, he hesitated. Not because he didn't know what to do, but because he finally did. He wasn't going to confront her. He wasn't going to make a scene. He was going to understand. And then, he was going to decide. Ethan took one last look at Claire. She was smiling again. Radiant, effortless, alive in a way he hadn't seen in years. Then he turned and walked out of the restaurant, the soft chime of the door echoing behind him. Claire never looked up, and that, somehow, hurt more than anything else. By the time Ethan stepped out onto the street, Manhattan had already surrendered to the night. The city shimmered in glass and light, reflections sliding across rain-slick pavement, taxis cutting through traffic like restless thoughts. Somewhere above, unseen behind steel and concrete, the sky held no stars, just a low, suffocating gray. Ethan paused under the restaurant awning, the cool air pressing against his face like a quiet demand to feel something, anything. But what came instead was clarity. Not peace, not yet, just clarity. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out his phone again. The message was still there, unchanged. Happy anniversary, my love. Sent at 8:42 p.m. He checked the time now. 8:49. 7 minutes had passed. Inside, Claire was likely still smiling, still leaning forward, still living in a moment that did not include him. Ethan exhaled slowly and stepped away from the entrance, blending into the moving current of pedestrians. No one looked at him twice. In this city, people learned early not to see what didn't concern them. He walked without direction at first, his mind replaying the scene in fragments. Claire's laugh, Daniel's hand, the way her eyes had softened. It was strange, the details that stayed. Not the betrayal itself, but the intimacy of it, the familiarity, as if he had been watching a version of their past, given to someone else. His phone vibrated again, another message, from Claire. Ethan stopped walking. For a moment, he didn't open it. He just stared at the screen, as if delaying the inevitable would somehow change the content. Then, slowly, he tapped. I wish you were here tonight. I booked that place you love, but something came up last minute. We'll celebrate properly this weekend, okay? Ethan let out a quiet breath that almost resembled a laugh. Not because it was funny, but because it was precise, carefully constructed. A lie layered on top of another lie, softened with just enough affection to make it believable. He turned, instinctively, glancing back toward the restaurant. From this distance, the warm glow of its windows looked almost inviting, like a scene from a life he no longer recognized. Inside that light, Claire existed in two realities at once, the woman who texted him and the woman who betrayed him. Ethan wondered, briefly, which one she believed was real, or if she needed both to survive. He typed the response. His fingers moved calmly, almost mechanically. Of course, I understand. Don't work too hard. He stared at the words before sending them. 10 years of marriage, reduced to a performance so seamless, even he could still play his part. Then he hit send. The message delivered instantly, and just like that, the illusion remained intact, for now. Claire's phone lit up on the table. She glanced down, her expression shifting for just a fraction of a second, something subtle, something Daniel might not have noticed. But if Ethan had been there, he would have, because after 10 years, he knew the difference between her real smile and the one she chose to show. Everything okay? Daniel asked, swirling the last of his whiskey. Claire looked up, her lips curving back into something effortless. Yeah, she said lightly. Just work. Daniel studied her for a moment longer than necessary. He wasn't a man who missed details. That didn't look like work, he said. Claire held his gaze, unfazed. You always this observant? Only when something doesn't add up. A beat of silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, but charged. Then Claire smiled again, this time softer, more deliberate. Then maybe you're looking too closely. Daniel leaned back slightly, considering her. Then he nodded, as if accepting the answer, or choosing not to push further. For now. Fair enough, he said. Claire placed her phone face down on the table. A small gesture, but a telling one. Because it wasn't about hiding the message. It was about choosing which world she was in, and tonight she had already decided. Several blocks away, Ethan entered a quiet bar tucked between two office buildings. It wasn't his usual place. That was intentional. He slid onto a stool at the far end, nodding once at the bartender. Bourbon, he said. Neat. The bartender poured without question. Ethan took the glass, turning it slightly in his hand, watching the amber liquid catch the dim light. For a long moment he didn't drink. Instead, he spoke, quietly, almost to himself. When does it start? The bartender glanced at him. Sorry? Ethan shook his head slightly. Nothing. But the question lingered. When did it start? Not the affair, that part was almost irrelevant now. He meant the distance, the silence, the invisible fracture that had widened slowly, quietly, until it became something irreversible. He thought back. Late nights of the office, missed dinners, conversations reduced to logistics. Did you pay the bill? I'll be home late. Let's talk this weekend. Always later, always eventually. Until eventually became never. Ethan finally took a sip of his drink, the burn sharper this time. He closed his eyes briefly. Not to escape, but to see more clearly. Claire hadn't become someone else overnight, and neither had he. They had both changed, just not in the same direction. Back at the restaurant, Claire and Daniel were finishing dessert. 10 years, Daniel said suddenly. Claire looked up. What? You mentioned it once, he continued. Your marriage. 10 years. Claire hesitated for the briefest moment. Then she nodded. Yeah, that's a long time. It is. Daniel studied her again. You don't sound convinced. Claire let out a quiet breath, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. Time doesn't always mean something is working, she said. And this? Daniel asked. What does this mean? Claire met his eyes. For a moment there was no performance, no deflection, just truth. It means I'm tired of pretending, she said. Daniel didn't respond immediately. Then, slowly, he reached across the table, not fully, not enough to draw attention, but enough that the space between them felt smaller. Then don't, he said. Claire's gaze flickered, something uncertain passing through it, but she didn't pull away. Ethan sat in silence long after his glass was empty. The city outside continued moving, indifferent to everything unraveling beneath its lights. He checked his phone one last time. No new messages. Of course not. Claire had already said everything she needed to say, and everything she didn't mean. Ethan stood, placing cash on the counter. As he stepped back into the night, one thought settled in his mind, clearer than anything else. He wasn't angry, not yet. What he felt was something far more dangerous. Patience. Because now he knew. And once you know the truth, you stop reacting. You start deciding. The next morning arrived like any other. Soft light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Walker apartment, stretching across polished marble floors and carefully curated furniture. The city below was already alive. Horns, footsteps, distant sirens blending into the familiar rhythm of Manhattan. Inside, everything looked untouched, unbroken. Claire stood in the kitchen, barefoot, her silk robe loosely tied at the waist. She moved with quiet efficiency, pouring coffee into 2 cups, just as she had done for years. The scent filled the space, warm and familiar. Routine. Ethan stood in the hallway for a moment before stepping in. He watched her. Not the way a husband watches his wife, but the way a stranger studies a scene, careful, detached, searching for meaning beneath the surface. "Morning," Claire said, without turning around. Her voice was soft, normal, perfect. "Morning," Ethan replied. He walked toward the counter, his movements measured, controlled. Claire slid the cup toward him without looking up. "Big day?" she asked. Ethan wrapped his fingers around the mug, feeling the heat seep into his skin. "Not really," he said. "You?" Claire shrugged lightly. "Meetings, a dinner thing tonight. Nothing exciting." Ethan nodded. A dinner thing. The phrase lingered in his mind, echoing against the memory of the night before. He took a sip of coffee. She didn't look at him. And he realized something, quietly, almost clinically. She wasn't nervous. There was no hesitation. No subtle shift in her tone. No flicker of guilt in her expression. Claire Walker was not a woman caught in a lie. She was a woman who had mastered it. They ate breakfast in silence. Not uncomfortable, not tense, just empty. Claire scrolled through her phone between bites, her thumb moving with practiced ease. Emails, messages, notifications. Ethan found himself watching her hands. The same hands that had brushed against Daniel's the night before. The same fingers that had typed, "Happy anniversary, my love." He looked away. "Hey," Claire said suddenly. Ethan glanced up. She smiled, soft, effortless, familiar. "We should still celebrate this weekend," she said. "Maybe that place in Tribeca you like." Ethan studied her face, every detail. The curve of her lips, the calm in her eyes, the ease in her posture. If he didn't know, he would believe her. "Yeah," he said. "That sounds good." Claire's smile lingered for a moment longer before she looked back down at her phone. Conversation over, just like that. Later that afternoon, Ethan found himself standing across the street from Claire's office building. He hadn't planned it, at least that's what he told himself. Glass towers rose above him, reflecting the sky like mirrors. People moved in and out of the building in a steady stream, professionals in tailored suits, voices blending into a constant murmur of ambition and urgency. Ethan checked his watch. 5:17 p.m. Claire usually left around 6. He leaned casually against a nearby railing, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable. Waiting. Watching. At 5:42, she appeared. Claire stepped out of the building with 2 colleagues, laughing at something one of them said. Her body language was open, natural, unburdened. Ethan felt that quiet shift again, that subtle fracture inside him widening just a little more. Because she looked happy. Not the curated happiness of social media. Real happiness. The kind she hadn't shown him in a long time. The colleagues peeled away after a few minutes, heading in opposite directions. Claire remained on the sidewalk, adjusting the strap of her bag. Then she reached for her phone. Ethan watched carefully. She typed something, paused, then smiled, just slightly. A different smile. Smaller, more intimate. Ethan didn't need to see the screen to know who it was for. Daniel Reeves stood across the street, not close enough to draw attention, not far enough to be accidental. He stepped forward as Claire approached, their movements aligning as if choreographed. They didn't hug. They didn't kiss. Not yet. But the space between them disappeared in a way that said everything. "Hey," Daniel said. "Hey," Claire replied. Simple, effortless, like something practiced. Ethan remained where he was, unseen among the crowd. He watched as they began to walk side by side, their shoulders occasionally brushing. Claire tilted her head toward him as he spoke, her attention fully his. Again, that gesture. That small, unconscious signal of interest, of care. Ethan felt his chest tighten, not with anger, but with something far more disorienting. Recognition. He had seen this before. He had felt this before. Just not recently. They entered a restaurant a few blocks away, different from the one the night before. Smaller, more private. Ethan followed at a distance, careful, precise. He stopped outside, positioning himself where he could see through the window without being obvious. Inside, Claire and Daniel sat across from each other. Closer this time, no pretense of distance. Claire laughed again, that same laugh, unfiltered. Daniel reached across the table. This time she didn't hesitate. Her hand met his, and stayed. Ethan's breath caught, just for a second, then steadied. Because now there was no ambiguity, no doubt, no illusion left to hold on to. This wasn't a moment, it wasn't a mistake, it was a choice. Repeated, deliberate, real. A memory surfaced, uninvited. Claire, years ago, sitting across from him in a small cafe, laughing just like that, reaching for his hand the same way, looking at him like he was the only person in the room. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, the reflection in the glass showed a different man. Not the husband, not the partner, just an observer, outside, looking in. Inside, Claire leaned forward, saying something Ethan couldn't hear. Daniel smiled. Then, slowly, he lifted her hand to his lips. A subtle gesture, but intimate enough to leave no room for interpretation. Claire didn't pull away. She watched him. And in her eyes, there was no guilt, only presence, only now. Ethan stepped back. The city noise rushed in again, filling the silence he hadn't realized he'd been holding. For a moment, he just stood there, not moving, not thinking, just absorbing. Then something inside him shifted, not breaking, not collapsing, rearranging. Because the pain, as sharp as it was, had begun to settle into something else, something colder, clearer, understanding. Claire wasn't hiding from him, not really. She was simply living a life that no longer included him. And maybe she hadn't even noticed the moment he stopped being part of it. Ethan turned away from the window. This time he didn't look back. He didn't need to. Because he had seen enough. More than enough. As he walked into the crowd, one thought echoed quietly in his mind. The betrayal wasn't the affair. It was how easily she had replaced him in the world. Back inside, Claire laughed again, her fingers still intertwined with Daniel's. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen, alive, free. And somewhere, deep beneath that feeling, something flickered, faint, almost imperceptible, but there. A hesitation. A question she chose not to ask. Because asking would mean stopping. And stopping would mean facing something she wasn't ready to confront. Not yet. Outside, Ethan disappeared into the city. Unnoticed, unfollowed, but no longer unaware. And once awareness takes root, silence is no longer passive. It becomes preparation. Ethan Walker did not confront the truth. He built a case. That was the difference between a husband and a lawyer, and in the days that followed, he chose to be the latter. Because emotion blurred vision. But evidence clarified everything. It began with patterns, not dramatic revelations, not hidden messages uncovered in a single moment of discovery. Just patterns. Claire left earlier than she used to, returned later. Her explanations were always reasonable. Meetings, networking events, last-minute client dinners. And perhaps that was what made them so effective. There was nothing to question, unless you already knew there was something to find. Ethan sat in his home office one evening, the glow of his laptop casting faint shadows across the room. The city outside pulsed with life, but inside, everything felt contained, controlled. He opened their shared calendar. At first glance, it looked ordinary. But Ethan wasn't looking for what stood out. He was looking for repetition. Every Thursday evening, client dinner. Every second Saturday, team retreat or brand event. Random enough to seem natural. Structured enough to mean something. He leaned back slightly, his fingers stippled under his chin. Then he cross-referenced. Locations, times, durations, and slowly something began to emerge. Not a coincidence, but a rhythm. Claire's absences aligned too perfectly, like appointments, not with clients, with someone. Daniel Reeves. Ethan said the name aloud once, quietly, as if testing its weight in the room. It lingered, heavy, familiar. He opened a separate file, one he had created years ago during Daniel's legal case. Confidential, thorough, detailed in the way only Ethan knew how to be. Back then, Daniel had been just another client. Powerful, calculated, a man who understood leverage better than most. Now, Ethan looked at him differently, not as a client, but as a variable. A constant presence in a system Ethan had failed to notice. He scrolled through the old documents, business dealings, partnerships, known associates, and then a detail that made him pause. Daniel had invested, quietly, in a media startup 3 years ago. A company that, at the time, had been struggling. Ethan narrowed his eyes slightly. Because he knew that company. Claire had joined it shortly after. At the time, she had called it an opportunity. A fresh start. He had supported her. Encouraged her even. Ethan leaned back slowly, the pieces beginning to shift into place. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but with a quiet inevitability that made the truth feel less like a discovery and more like something that had always been there, waiting. The affair hadn't started recently. It had roots, deep ones. Claire stepped out of the shower, steam still clinging to her skin as she wrapped herself in a towel. The apartment was quiet. Ethan was in his office, as usual. She moved toward the bedroom, her phone resting on the nightstand. The screen lit up as a notification appeared. Daniel. She glanced at it briefly, then picked it up. Dinner tomorrow. Same place? Claire hesitated, just for a second, then typed yes. Simple, efficient, no unnecessary words, because there was no need for them. Not anymore. In the office, Ethan watched the mirror reflection of the hallway through the glass panel beside his desk. Not directly, never directly, just enough to remain aware. He saw the light shift as Claire entered the bedroom. He heard the faint creak of the floorboards. Then silence. Ethan turned back to his screen. He wasn't tracking her movements, not in the way suspicion might suggest. He was observing behavior, documenting, understanding, because what he was building wasn't confrontation, it was clarity. The next piece came unexpectedly, a receipt. Not hidden, not even particularly guarded. It was tucked inside Claire's bag, visible only because she had left it partially unzipped on the kitchen counter. Ethan noticed it in passing, paused, then calmly reached for it. A restaurant. Not one he recognized. 2 people, wine, dessert. The date? 8 months ago. Ethan stared at it for a long moment. 8 months. At least. Maybe more. He placed the receipt back exactly where he had found it. No disruption, no trace. But something inside him shifted again. Not shock, not even anger, just adjustment. Because the timeline mattered. It reframed everything, every conversation, every absence, every moment he had chosen not to question. Later that night, they sat together on the couch. A movie played softly in the background, neither of them truly watching. Claire leaned against him, her head resting lightly on his shoulder. The gesture was instinctive, habitual. Ethan didn't move, didn't react. He simply sat there, aware of the weight of her presence, and the distance within it. "Do you ever think about us?" Claire asked suddenly. The question came out of nowhere, or perhaps not. Ethan glanced down at her. "What about us?" Claire shifted slightly, her fingers tracing absent patterns on his arm. "Like, where we're going," she said, "if this is what we want." Ethan studied her face. There was something there. Not guilt, not exactly, but something close to uncertainty. "Is it not?" he asked. Claire didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched. Then, "I don't know," she said softly. Ethan nodded once, as if that answer made sense, as if it was enough. But inside, something settled into place with quiet finality. Because this wasn't just an affair. It was an exit. Claire wasn't simply betraying him. She was leaving. Slowly, carefully, without ever saying the words. The final confirmation came 2 nights later. Ethan followed them again. Not out of desperation, not out of obsession, but because the pattern had led him there. A private lounge, dim lighting, no public visibility. Claire and Daniel sat close this time, no distance, no hesitation. Their conversation was quieter, more intimate, less performance, more truth. Ethan remained in the shadows, unseen. And then he heard it. Claire's voice, low, honest in a way he hadn't heard in years. "I can't keep doing this halfway," she said. Daniel didn't respond immediately. Then don't. A pause. "What about him?" Daniel asked. Claire looked down for a moment, then back up. And when she spoke again, her voice didn't break. "I'll figure it out." Ethan closed his eyes, just for a second. Because that was it. Not the touch, not the lies, not even the months of betrayal. That was the moment everything became irreversible. When he opened his eyes again, his expression was calm, almost unreadable. Because the investigation was over, there was nothing left to uncover, only something left to decide. Back at the apartment, Claire stood alone by the window, looking out at the city. Her reflection stared back at her, perfect, composed, untouched. But her thoughts were louder now, more persistent. She pressed her hand lightly against the glass. Cool, real, unlike everything else. For a brief moment, doubt surfaced, sharp, unwelcome. But she pushed it down, because moving forward was easier than looking back. Somewhere in the city, Ethan walked alone. Not lost, not wandering, just moving. Because staying still meant feeling, and he wasn't ready for that yet. Not fully, not completely. The truth had been uncovered, layer by layer, detail by detail, and now it stood before him, clear, undeniable, complete. Claire's affair wasn't an accident. It wasn't a mistake. It was a decision, repeated over time, rooted in something deeper than impulse. And Daniel Reeves, he wasn't just the other man. He was the life Claire had chosen. Ethan exhaled slowly. The night air felt different now, sharper, colder, honest. Because once the truth is fully seen, there is no going back to illusion, only forward, toward whatever comes next. The truth, Ethan realized, was not a single moment. It was a slow accumulation of everything that had gone unspoken. The apartment was unusually quiet that evening. Claire had come home earlier than expected, her heels abandoned near the door, her bag resting carelessly on the kitchen counter. The city outside hummed as always, but inside there was a stillness that felt unfamiliar. Ethan noticed it immediately. He stepped inside, loosening his tie, his eyes scanning the room with quiet awareness. Claire was sitting by the window. No phone, no television, no distractions, just her and the reflection of the city lights dancing across the glass. "You're home early," he said. She didn't turn right away. "Yeah," Claire replied softly. "Meetings got cancelled." Ethan nodded, placing his keys down with deliberate calm. He studied her for a moment. There was something different, not visible, but present, like a shift in the air before a storm. They ate dinner together for the first time in weeks, not at a restaurant, not in silence while scrolling through their phones, but at the table, across from each other, the way they used to. Claire picked at her food more than she ate. Her gaze drifted often toward the window, toward the glass, anywhere but him. Ethan noticed everything, but said nothing, because he was beginning to understand something crucial. The truth didn't always need to be forced. Sometimes it surfaced on its own. "Do you remember Chicago?" Claire's voice broke the silence without warning. Ethan looked up. "Chicago?" he repeated. She nodded faintly, a small smile touching her lips, fragile, almost distant. "Our second year," she said, "before everything got complicated." Ethan leaned back slightly, the memory forming slowly. A small apartment, cold winters, take-out dinners on the floor because they couldn't afford furniture yet. "You hated the cold," he said. Claire let out a soft breath that almost resembled a laugh. "I hated everything about that city," she admitted. "Except you." The words hung between them, simple but heavy. Ethan didn't respond immediately, because he remembered that version of them too, before success, before expectations, before they had become people who needed to maintain something instead of just living it. "I used to think we were building something," Claire continued. Her fingers traced the edge of her glass, slow, absent. "Something real, something that was ours." Ethan watched her carefully. "And now?" he asked. Claire finally looked at him, really looked, and for the first time in a long time there was no performance in her eyes, just honesty. "I don't know what this is anymore," she said. The words weren't sharp, they didn't accuse, but they landed harder than anything else could have. Ethan nodded once, not because he agreed, but because he understood, more than she realized. "You work all the time," Claire said, her voice quiet but steady. "You're always somewhere else, even when you're here." Ethan didn't interrupt. "You stopped asking me how I was," she continued. "Stopped noticing things. I felt like..." She hesitated. "Like what?" Ethan asked. Claire swallowed lightly. "Like I disappeared," she said. The room fell silent again, but this time it wasn't empty. It was full of everything they had never said. Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping to the table for a moment. When he looked back up, his voice was calm. "You could have told me." Claire's lips parted slightly, but no words came at first. "Then I tried," she said. Ethan studied her. "When?" Claire shook her head faintly, a sad smile forming. "It doesn't matter now." But it did. It mattered more than anything, because Ethan realized in that moment that he couldn't remember. Not clearly, not definitively. There had been moments, small ones, comments, frustrations, silences, but he had always been too busy, too focused, too certain that what they had was strong enough to survive neglect. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this," Claire said suddenly. Ethan's eyes lifted again. There it was. Not a confession, not yet, but close enough. "How did it happen?" he asked quietly. Claire hesitated. Her fingers tightened slightly around her glass. Then she let out a slow breath. "It just felt different," she said. Ethan didn't need to ask who she meant. Different how? Claire looked away again, toward the city. "Like I was seen," she said. "Like someone actually noticed me. Not just what I do. Not just what I represent. Me." Ethan felt something tighten in his chest, because he understood that feeling, more than he wanted to. "And with me?" he asked. The question was simple, but it carried years within it. Claire closed her eyes briefly. "When we're together," she said softly, "it feels like we're just maintaining something, like we're trying to keep it from falling apart instead of actually living in it." Ethan absorbed that in silence, because she wasn't wrong, and that was the hardest part. "I never wanted to hurt you," Claire added. Ethan almost smiled at that, not out of humor, but because of how familiar that sentence was, how often it followed choices that did exactly that. "I know," he said, and he did. That was what made it worse. The conversation ended not with resolution, but with exhaustion. Claire stood first, collecting the plates with quiet efficiency. Ethan watched her move around the kitchen, every gesture precise, controlled, familiar, and yet completely foreign. Because now he saw it differently. Everything. Not as moments within a marriage, but as fragments of something already broken. Later that night, they lay in bed, side by side, not touching. The distance between them felt larger than the space allowed. Claire stared at the ceiling, her thoughts restless. Ethan faced the opposite direction, his eyes open in the dark. Neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't change everything. In the quiet, Ethan finally allowed himself to feel it. Not the anger, not yet, but the loss. Not of Claire, but of what they had been, of what they could have been, of all the moments that had slipped through unnoticed until they were gone. And Claire, she felt it too, though she wouldn't name it, not yet, because naming it would mean acknowledging that she had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Somewhere between them, in the silence of that room, the truth settled fully into place. Their marriage hadn't been destroyed by betrayal. It had been fading long before that. The affair wasn't the beginning, it was the symptom. And now, all that remained was the ending. The idea came to Ethan the next morning. Not suddenly, not like inspiration, but like something inevitable, something that had been forming quietly beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to take shape. He stood in his office, staring out at the skyline, the city stretching endlessly before him. For the first time in days, his mind felt still, clear, decided. Behind him, his phone buzzed softly on the desk. Claire. He let it ring once, twice. Then he turned, picked it up, and answered. "Hey," he said. Her voice came through warm, almost relieved. "I was thinking," Claire began, "about what I said last night." Ethan didn't interrupt. "We shouldn't just let this drift," she continued. 10 years, it should mean something. Maybe we should do something real, together. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, not because the words hurt, but because of how carefully they were chosen. "Yeah," he said, "I was thinking the same thing." A pause. Then Claire's tone softened. "Really?" "Yeah," Ethan replied. "Let's do something bigger." "How big?" she asked, a faint curiosity threading through her voice. Ethan looked out of the city again. "Let's host a party," he said. "Invite everyone, friends, family, colleagues. Make it a real celebration." There was silence on the other end. Then, "That's unexpected," Claire said. Ethan allowed a small, controlled smile. "Is that a no?" "No," she said quickly. "No, I just..." She let out a light breath. "I didn't think you'd want something like that." "People change," Ethan said. The words carried more weight than she realized. Claire hesitated, then laughed softly. "I guess they do." "So?" Ethan asked. "You're in?" Another pause. Then, "Yeah," she said. "I'm in." The planning began immediately. Claire threw herself into it with a kind of energy Ethan hadn't seen in months. Venues, guest lists, catering options, decor. She moved through it all with precision and enthusiasm, her phone constantly in hand, her voice light and animated as she coordinated details. To anyone watching, she looked like a woman excited to celebrate her marriage, and perhaps, in some way, she believed that. Ethan observed, always from a slight distance. Not detached, but no longer full inside the moment. He watched the way Claire smiled when discussing the guest list. "Should we invite Daniel?" she asked casually one afternoon, scrolling through names. The question came lightly, almost too lightly. Ethan didn't react immediately. He walked over, glancing at the list, as if considering it purely from a social standpoint. "Is he important to your work?" he asked. Claire shrugged, her expression neutral. "He's connected," she said. "It would make sense." Ethan nodded slowly. "Then invite him." Claire looked up at him for a brief second. Something flickered in her eyes. Surprise, or maybe something closer to suspicion. But it passed quickly. "Okay," she said, returning her attention to the screen. Ethan turned away before she could look too closely. The venue they chose was a rooftop space overlooking the Hudson. Elegant, private, designed for people who valued appearances as much as experience. The kind of place where everything looked perfect no matter what lay beneath. Ethan approved it without hesitation, because it fit, not just the image, but the moment. Days passed in a blur of preparation. Claire moved through the apartment with renewed purpose, her laughter returning in small bursts, her energy almost contagious. She tried, occasionally, to pull Ethan into it. "What do you think about this color scheme? Should we go with a live band or a DJ? Do you think people will like this?" Ethan always answered, always engaged, just enough. Because the performance required consistency, and he was very good at playing his role. At night, when the apartment grew quiet again, the distance returned. Unspoken, unavoidable. Claire would lie beside him, sometimes closer than before, as if trying to breathe something she couldn't fully define. Ethan remained still, present, but unreachable in a way she hadn't noticed yet. 3 nights before the party, Claire stood in front of the mirror, trying on a dress. Deep blue, elegant, designed to draw attention without asking for it. "What do you think?" she asked, turning slightly. Ethan leaned against the doorway, watching her. She looked stunning. There was no denying that. "You look good," he said. Claire met his eyes in the reflection. Just good? Ethan stepped closer, his expression calm. You look like someone people won't be able to stop looking at, he said. Claire smiled faintly. Is that what I'm supposed to be? Ethan held her gaze. Isn't it what you've always been? The question lingered longer than either of them expected. Claire turned away first. The night of the party arrived with a kind of quiet inevitability. The rooftop glowed under soft lighting, the city stretching endlessly beyond the glass barriers. Music drifted through the air, low and smooth, blending with the murmur of conversation as guests began to arrive. Laughter, champagne, polished smiles, everything exactly as it should be. Claire moved through the crowd effortlessly, greeting people, accepting compliments, her presence magnetic. She played her part perfectly. Ethan watched from across the room, a glass in his hand, unmoving, observing. Because tonight wasn't about celebration, it was about truth. Daniel Reeves arrived at 8:17 p.m. Ethan noticed immediately. Of course he did. Daniel stepped onto the rooftop with quiet confidence, his gaze scanning the room before settling, inevitably, on Claire. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, the world around them seemed to blur. Claire's smile shifted, subtle, but unmistakable. She moved toward him, not too quickly, not too obviously, but with intention. Ethan felt that familiar stillness settle over him again. Not anger, not jealousy, just confirmation. Ethan. The voice came from behind him. He turned. Daniel stood there now, extending a hand. Congratulations, he said. 10 years. That's impressive. Ethan looked at him for a moment before shaking his hand. Thank you, he replied. Their grip was firm, measured. Two men standing in the same space, understanding more than they said. Claire joined them seconds later. Her presence shifted the air immediately. Daniel, she said, her voice light. I'm glad you came. Wouldn't miss it, he replied. Her eyes flickered briefly toward Ethan, just for a second, as if checking something. But Ethan's expression gave nothing away. The three of them stood there, together, a perfect image, a flawless illusion. Husband, wife, and the man who existed between them. As the night continued, the energy grew, music louder, voices brighter, drinks flowing more freely. The performance reaching its peak. Ethan stepped away from the crowd, toward the edge of the rooftop. The city stretched out before him, endless and indifferent. He took a slow breath, because the moment was coming, closer now, inevitable. Behind him, Claire laughed again, that same laugh, the one he had memorized, the one that no longer belonged to him. Ethan turned back toward the room, his gaze moving across the crowd, taking in every detail, every face, every illusion. Then, slowly, he set his glass down. The music didn't stop, that was the strange part. Even as everything began to shift, the soft rhythm of jazz continued drifting through the rooftop, blending with laughter that hadn't yet realized it was about to disappear. Ethan stood near the center of the room now, not elevated, not demanding attention, just present. But something about him had changed. People felt it before they understood it. Claire noticed first. She was mid-conversation, a glass of champagne in her hand, Daniel standing just slightly too close beside her. Her eyes found Ethan across the room, and for a brief second she hesitated. Not because she knew, but because something in his stillness didn't match the night they had built together. Ethan? She called lightly, stepping toward him. You okay? Her voice carried just enough to draw attention. A few nearby guests turned, then a few more. Ethan met her gaze, calm, unshaken. Yeah, he said. I just wanted to say something. Claire smiled, relieved by the normalcy of his tone. Okay, she said, glancing around. Should we... No, Ethan interrupted gently. This is fine. That was when the room began to quiet. Not all at once, but gradually. Conversations fading, eyes shifting, attention settling. Because something in his voice, quiet as it was, didn't ask for silence. It created it. Ethan looked around the room. Friends, colleagues, people who had watched their marriage from the outside and believed in its perfection. He took a slow breath, then began. Thank you all for being here tonight, he said. His voice was steady, measured, the voice of a man accustomed to being heard. Claire stepped closer, standing beside him now. Her smile remained in place, but her fingers tightened slightly around her glass. 10 years is a long time, Ethan continued. Long enough to build something people admire. A few guests nodded faintly, polite, expectant. This, he gestured lightly to the space around them, is what that looks like. Soft laughter, agreement, the performance still intact. Ethan paused, just long enough. Then, but I've been thinking a lot about what it actually means. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. Claire's smile faltered, just slightly. Because from the outside, Ethan said, everything looks perfect. He turned his head, his gaze moving briefly across Claire, not lingering, not accusing, just acknowledging. And maybe that's the problem. The room stilled further. Claire let out a small, uncertain laugh. Ethan, she said softly, a warning hidden beneath the tone. But he didn't stop. I received a message a few nights ago, he continued. His eyes returned to the crowd. A simple one. His hand slipped into his pocket, pulling out his phone. Claire's breath caught, barely noticeable, but real. Ethan looked at the screen for a moment, then read aloud, "Happy anniversary, my love." A murmur passed through the room, confused, curious. Claire's face went still. Ethan lifted his gaze again. "I got that message," he said, while I was sitting 2 tables away from the person who sent it. Silence, complete now, heavy, unavoidable. Claire's fingers loosened. The champagne glass trembled slightly in her hand. "Ethan," she whispered, but her voice didn't carry this time. "I didn't say anything," he continued, still calm, still controlled. "I didn't interrupt. I didn't make a scene." He glanced briefly toward Daniel, just once. That was all it took, because Daniel understood, immediately. "I watched," Ethan said, "and I realized something." His voice softened, not weaker, but deeper. Betrayal doesn't happen in a moment. He looked at Claire now, fully. For it to reach that point, it has to exist long before. Claire shook her head slightly, her eyes searching his face. This wasn't how this was supposed to happen. Not like this. Not here. "You don't wake up one day and fall out of love," Ethan continued. "You drift, slowly, quietly, until one day you're already gone." The words landed not just on Claire, but on everyone listening, because they felt true. And truth, when spoken clearly, doesn't need volume. Claire stepped closer to him now, her voice urgent, low. "Stop," she said. "Please." Ethan looked at her, and for the first time, there was something there. Not anger, not cruelty, just finality. "I'm not saying this to hurt you," he said, softly, honestly. "I'm saying it because it's already true." Claire's eyes filled, not with tears, but with something sharper. Exposure. Ethan turned slightly, his gaze sweeping across the room one last time. "I think," he said, "we spend too much time trying to protect what things look like, instead of facing what they are." No one spoke. No one moved. Then, he placed his phone back into his pocket, and stepped back. Not dramatically, not with emphasis, just a step. But it created distance, a visible one, between him and Claire. The illusion shattered in that space, not loudly, not violently, but completely. Claire stood there, alone in the center of it, every eye on her now, every silence pressing in. Her mind raced, searching for something to say, something to fix, something to hold on to. But there was nothing, because the truth, once exposed, leaves no room for performance. Daniel shifted slightly where he stood. For the first time that night, he looked uncertain. Not because of what had been revealed, but because of how it had been done. Clean, precise, unavoidable. Claire finally spoke, her voice quieter than it had ever been. She began, but the words didn't come, because there was no version of this where she could explain her way out. No narrative she could reshape, no audience she could win back. Ethan watched her, not with satisfaction, not with triumph, but with a kind of quiet understanding, because this wasn't about winning, it never had been. After a moment, he reached for his jacket. Simple, unhurried, as if the night had ended exactly as he expected. "Happy anniversary," he said. The words were gentle, almost kind, but they carried no illusion anymore. Then he turned and walked away. No one stopped him, no one spoke. The music still played softly in the background, absurd now, disconnected from the reality that had just taken its place. Claire remained where she was, standing in the center of everything that had just collapsed. Her chest rose and fell unevenly, her thoughts scattered, her composure slipping in ways she couldn't control. Around her, people looked away, or pretended to, because witnessing truth is uncomfortable, especially when it strips something down so completely. Daniel stepped forward, his voice low. "Claire," but she stepped back, just slightly, enough to create space, because for the first time, she saw everything clearly. Not just Ethan, not just the marriage, but herself. And there was no version of this where she didn't have to face it. Across the rooftop, the door closed softly behind Ethan. The city swallowed him whole. Lights, noise, movement, life continuing as if nothing had happened. But something had, irreversibly, because the truth had finally been spoken. And once it is, there is no going back. The city did not stop for heartbreak. It never did. By the time Ethan stepped onto the street, the night had already moved on. Cars passing in streaks of light, people laughing somewhere in the distance, the low hum of Manhattan continuing as if nothing had just unraveled above it. He stood there for a moment, still, breathing, not because he was overwhelmed, but because he wasn't. And that, more than anything, felt unfamiliar. There had been a time when Ethan believed pain would come like a storm, violent, uncontrollable, something that would tear through him and leave nothing intact. But this was something else entirely. Quiet, measured, final. He began to walk, no destination in mind, just movement, because staying still belonged to the life he had just left behind. Behind him, high above the street, the rooftop still held its silence. Claire hadn't moved for a long time, even after people began to leave, even after the music was cut, even after the staff started clearing glasses and folding away pieces of a night that had ended too abruptly. She remained where Ethan had left her, as if stepping away would make everything real. Claire, the voice came gently this time, not Daniel, someone else, a friend, concerned, careful. You should sit down. Claire blinked, as if waking from something. I'm fine, she said automatically, but her voice didn't match the words. Daniel stood a few feet away, watching, not approaching again, not pushing, because even he understood this wasn't the moment he could step into, not anymore. Claire finally moved, one step, then another. Her heels echoed softly against the floor, each sound too loud in the emptiness that had replaced the party. She reached the edge of the rooftop, the same place Ethan had stood earlier. The city stretched out before her, unchanged, unmoved. Her reflection stared back at her in the glass, perfect, composed, untouched. But she knew better now, because for the first time, there was no one left to perform for. Her phone buzzed in her hand. She looked down. Ethan. A message. Simple. Direct. I'll have my things moved out tomorrow. No anger. No accusations. No questions. Just a decision. Claire stared at the screen. Her chest tightened, not sharply, but deeply. Because this was it. Not a fight. Not a breakdown. Not something she could fix with words or explanations. Just an ending. Claire, Daniel said again, more quietly now. She turned to him, and for a moment neither of them spoke, because everything that had once felt certain between them now seemed different, not wrong, but no longer untouched by consequence. Are you okay? He asked. Claire held his gaze. She thought about the nights they had shared, the laughter, the ease, the way she had felt seen in a way she hadn't in years. All of it was still real, but now it existed alongside something else, something heavier. I don't know, she said honestly. And that was the first real answer she had given all night. Daniel nodded slowly. He didn't move closer, didn't reach for her, because something had shifted, and even he wasn't sure where he stood within it anymore. Claire looked back out at the city, her mind replaying everything. Not just the exposure, not just Ethan walking away, but all the moments that had led here. The silences, the choices, the justifications you had made because they were easier than confronting the truth. I thought I had time, she said suddenly. Daniel frowned slightly. Time for what? Claire let out a quiet breath. To figure it out, she said. To end things the right way. To not hurt him like that. Her voice faltered slightly. But I didn't. Because the truth was, she hadn't chosen between two lives. She had tried to hold both, and in doing so, she had lost control of both. Ethan walked for nearly an hour before he stopped. He found himself by the river, the water dark and endless beneath the reflection of city lights. For the first time since the rooftop, he sat. The silence here was different, not heavy, not suffocating, just open. He thought about Claire, not with anger, not even with resentment, but with a kind of clarity he hadn't had before. He saw her as she was now, and as she had been, and as they had been together. The early years, the laughter, the feeling of building something real, that had existed. It hadn't been a lie. But neither was this. Ethan leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees, and slowly he let it go. Not in a dramatic moment, not with a final thought or a defining realization, but in the quiet acceptance that came after everything had already been decided. Because holding on required effort, and for the first time in a long time, he chose not to. Back on the rooftop, Claire stood alone. Daniel had left, the staff had finished, the lights were dimming. She remained. Because going home and facing what was no longer there, her phone still in her hand, Ethan's message still on the screen. She typed a response, stopped, deleted it, tried again. There was so much he could say, explanations, apologies, fragments of truth, but none of it would change what had happened. None of it would bring him back to that moment before everything broke. And for the first time, she understood something Ethan had known before she did. Some endings don't come from a lack of love. They come from a lack of truth. Claire lowered her phone slowly, her reflection still watching her. But now, she couldn't meet its eyes for long, because this time, There was no illusion left to hide behind. Days later, the apartment felt different. Not emptier, just quieter. Ethan's things were gone. Not all at once, not violently, just gradually, precisely, like everything else he had done. Claire walked through the space, her fingers brushing against objects that no longer held the same meaning. The couch where they had sat, the kitchen where they had shared routines, the bedroom where silence had replaced connection long before either of them admitted it. Everything was still there, and yet nothing was. She stopped by the window. The city stretched out before her again, unchanged, unmoved. But she was not. Somewhere else in that same city, Ethan stepped into a new apartment, smaller, simpler, unfinished. He set his keys down, looked around, and for the first time in a long time, there was no expectation in the room, no performance, no version of himself he needed to maintain, just space. Ethan walked to the window. The same city, a different view. He exhaled slowly, not with relief, not with regret, but with something quieter. Freedom. Because in the end, he hadn't chosen to destroy anything. He had simply refused to keep living inside something that no longer existed. And sometimes, walking away isn't weakness. It's the only way to remain whole.